When gaming critics get together, they often delegate who reviews what kind of games. You have the people who already know and love a genre review new games that fall into that same genre. That way, when the review comes out, you don't have the confusion of the reviewer saying, "It just wasn't for me," which might not inform the viewer as well as other reviewers might have been able to. This isn't one of those cases though. I've always struggled to enjoy turn-based JRPGs. It dates back to when I was a kid trying Final Fantasy VII for the first time. I remember getting to a train yard and some factories early in the game and becoming frustrated by a boss fight I could never beat. All of this to say, Cris Tales isn't really for me, but I wanted to give it the fairest shot that I could. Let's back it up a bit though, because there's a lot that Cris Tales has going for it, especially in those first 10 to 15 hours. The Colombian-produced turn-based JRPG had its demo released last summer in 2020, while the full game was scheduled to release in November of that same year. As you all know, however, the pandemic has made it so many games aren't arriving on time despite the best intentions of the development teams. I mentioned the development teams twice now because their Colombian influence is apparent given the gorgeous art style of the game. The 2D hand-drawn artwork is impeccable and one of my favorite parts of the experience. All of the environments and characters pop in fun and vibrant ways, making Cris Tales a constant delight. Visually, that is. And as much of a treat as it is for the eyes, the music also fares just as you might expect from the JRPG genre. Orchestral tracks make combat a far more exciting affair, while the calmer tones of the game's quieter moments offer a relaxing experience. And, while I won't be looking for the Cris Tales OST on YouTube anytime soon, I enjoyed many of the tracks I heard while playing the 30-hour campaign. Now that I mentioned the hour count, you may be thinking, 30 hours seems pretty solid for an indie turn-based JRPG. But unfortunately, the pacing of this game ensures that it feels much longer than 30 hours. In those 30 hours, you play as a young, happy-go-lucky time mage named Crispell, who embarks on a fairly by-the-books campaign to stop a seemingly unstoppable villain. Despite the solid setup, Cris Tales is intent on throwing constant wrenches into the previously mentioned simplistic premise in an attempt to add a level of gravitas to the story. But there's a reason why so many people love stories about good and evil. We don't need to have tragic and semi-understandable backstories to make villains great, and in this case, keeping things simpler would have been a perfectly serviceable approach. Unfortunately, through introducing all of those twists and turns, Cris Tales feels more like a played-out M. Night Shyamalan film than anything else. The twists are predictable, and laughably so. I unwittingly predicted the biggest twist of them all while making a joke, which speaks to the game's often comedic attempts to surprise its audience. A worse offense, perhaps, than its main ending, which, save for spoilers, leverages a frustrating cliffhanger that does the story no favors. That said, the plot isn't bad by any means. The first 15 to 20 hours are good, as I said before, great even, with solid voice acting, sufficient turn-based combat, and interesting and lovable characters. But the game's biggest mistake is adding enough padding in the last 10 hours that you could parachute from 30 stories up, and you would safely land on it. The story eventually becomes engrossed in a much larger plot that received little to no build-up beforehand, and is explained far too quickly to leave much of a lasting emotional impression. There is some good grace to be saved in the characters, however, many of whom I loved, especially the trickster Zaz, Wilhelm and Christopher's back and forth, and even some of the villains.
Well, that takes care of that.
You're pretty strong for a stomach on legs.
You're not bad for a big mouth and a fancy jacket.
We will have time to banter later.
But these promising attributes are frustrated by the fact that Cris Tales refuses to get with the times, ironically enough. This is glaringly obvious in outdated mechanics like the inability to save wherever you want, instead being forced to save manually in limited areas, which leads to frustrating time loss if you suddenly die early in the game to a random encounter. And those random encounters are completely out of your control. Not until halfway through the game can you control when random encounters work. This led many dungeons to have a frustrating pace in the early game. Another frustrating gameplay element is that far too many bosses can heal themselves. I've long thought this was a cheap tactic to artificially lengthen boss fights, and turn-based JRPGs are already notorious for long fights as it is. This can make what would otherwise be interesting and intense boss fights tedious and borderline frustrating at times. The combat in general involves attacks that require precise timing for the most damage and the best defending, which can make battles more engaging than they might otherwise be. For example, if you press, at least for the PlayStation 5, X at the right time, then you'll parry or deflect. Similarly with attacks, a well-timed button press will also help you land a good or critical hit instead of just a normal strike. These are relatively simple ideas in the heat of things, but one mechanic that makes combat more interesting is the ability to send enemies to the past or future, which can alter how enemies react to certain effects and attacks and work nicely with your other companions' abilities. Though as you get further into the game, these strategies become less necessary, and only on a particularly tough boss fight halfway through the game may they come back into focus. Though overall, that focus is lost, especially as you get past 20 hours or so, as the game is very repetitive. Small wrinkles are added into the combat via new party members here and there, but they don't do nearly enough to rejuvenate a largely simplistic battle scheme which feels played out by the 15th hour. It also doesn't help that the enemy variety is mostly spent by then, with only minor differences cropping up in the game's latter half, making an already somewhat stale experience rougher still. That isn't even mentioning the repeat boss fights, backtracking towards the end of the game, and fetch quests that make up much of the side content. Unfortunately, I felt like only a few of the side quests were actually meaningful, save for one which had a character who shared a name with my partner, but, that's cheating. The frustrations don't end there, however. Although Cris Tales developers said they took inspiration from early turn-based JRPGs, I wish they hadn't skipped out on one of the earliest and most notable, Pokemon Red, where you can avoid random encounters at will from early in the game. Instead, Cris Tales takes inspiration from the more frustrating elements surrounding the genre. Despite everything I've said, and what I prefaced this review with, I did overall enjoy my time with Cris Tales, and it reminded me that, for me anyway, turn-based RPGs can be almost as much fun as their action RPG counterparts. But Cris Tales find itself, ironically, too stuck in the past to give a satisfying experience throughout. And though there are moments of brilliance, and the artwork is stellar, unfortunately that cannot stop this mediocre experience from being lost to time. Not even a time age can stop that. If I could turn back time, if I could find a way. And I don't remember the rest of the lyrics.